Hi everyone. Okay, so welcome, and I will do this presentation in English so that most people have the benefit of it. We're going to talk about social exclusion. So I'll start out about research into social exclusion. There's many different types of studies that have given insight into the condition of social exclusion. Epidemiologists are looking at health risk factors for the socially excluded. Quantitative sociologists have looked at the number of socially excluded, their characteristic, and so on. Anthropological studies of social exclusion have given insight into a variety of themes regarding the phenomenon of social exclusion, but these studies have also shown some of the problems and challenges of conducting research and of understanding social exclusion. Some of these problems are problems of representation, which Philippe Bourgois, and that's the guy we see at the picture here. And another problem is the distortion of data. There's been a controversy about Alice Goffman, which we can talk about later. And then there's the preeminence of power and interactionism, this preoccupation with social construction of social problems, which overshadows understanding of the phenomenon. And I will talk about these three themes. The problems of representation, the distortion of data, and the eclipsing of constructionism and the prevalence of power and interactionism in research into social exclusion. The problem of representation is connected to the purpose of ethnography and social science in general to counter stereotypes. Thus, one of the purposes of social science, such as anthropology, have been defined as to counter common sense and fight social stereotypes, a well-established task of social science, and especially ethnography, for which it supplies one traditional warrant. And that's a quote from Katz and Wacquant. And so this has been one of the definitions of the purposes of social science and especially ethnography to counter this common sense and fight off social stereotypes. The critique has been that anthropology has constructed a too stereotypical depiction of the represented other, and that anthropological works are imposing a Western normative view upon the other. As such, the works are described as creating and distorting our image of the other by evoking typified images and reproduction of our very own normative understanding. In the anthropological research on social exclusion, such as homelessness, we see the problem of representation as well. The problem of representation is connected to a critique on how the socially excluded are being presented or represented in society, both in the general meter, but as said, also in research, such as in ethnography. And that is, of course, a big problem if one of the purposes of social science and ethnography is to counter these common sense and images of social exclusion and ideas of social exclusion, and to fight off the stereotypes. In an American context, anthropologist Robert Desjarlais has critiqued the media for dehumanizing the homeless people, who writes in his monograph Shelter Blues that the homeless themselves serve to counter images of health, wealth, purity, and high culture. The imagery passes swiftly, unquestionably, as if it was in the nature of sentences of putting words onto paper, to set pain against beauty and wretchedness against form. This is from 1997 from his Shelter Blues, as said, and here we have a critique of homeless people being misrepresented and dehumanized. He goes on to say also that many journalists, politicians, and films cast the homeless as negative figures. He uses Emile Rorty and says that she notes that figures are defined by their place in an unfolding drama. They are not assigned roles because of their traits, but rather have the traits of their prototypes. In myth or sacred script, they are rarely individuated, even if they are endowed with 2 or 3 physical details. And he also goes on to say that The identification of homeless people is typically achieved through spectral means. One knows the homeless not by talking with them, but by seeing them. Thus, a common problematic vision is apparent in many accounts. The homeless live in an underworld. They are a ghostly, animal-like brood who threatens the peaceful, artful air of cafes, libraries, and public squares. Television shows and Hollywood movies like The Fisher King create pictures of ghostly, ragged vagabonds haunting the post-industrial wasteland of American cities, while newspaper accounts thrive on images of death, transgression, and grotesque bodies. So, finally, Desjarlais concludes that homelessness denotes a temporary lack of housing, but connotes a lasting moral career. Sorry about my English. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So the problem with this is that homelessness, which for Desjarlais is just a temporary lack of housing. He says that's how you ought to see it, but it becomes to mean so much more. Now, question is, of course, if Desjarlais is correct in this, does homelessness actually denote a temporary lack of housing only? That is definitely a big question. But his point here about homelessness being homeless people being dehumanized and having a too rigid and too stereotypical picture, which is the opposite of a human connected to it. This animal-like brood he talks about. The sociologist Katz, which I quoted in the beginning, for saying that social science purpose is to combat stereotypes, have been nuanced by sociologist Loic Wacquant. Wacquant says that we ought not risk replacing stereotypes with a neo-romantic look on the socially excluded. What he means is that the negative portrayal of the socially excluded, which Desjarlais describes, ought not to be replaced by romantic description of positive images of the socially excluded. Thus, we have to be careful when we portray social exclusion, and we have to make sure we do not replace one stereotype with the other. So the idea is here that, okay, Desjarlais and other social scientists have pointed to the fact that people have a too negative, because it's dehumanized, right? So that's a negative view on this homeless population and socially marginalized people in general. But what Wacquant says is the problem is also that we do not want to replace this negative stereotype with a positive stereotype, because the task of social science is to have a correct stereotype, and then the problem is, of course, social scientific. Is that possible? And then that's of course a social or a philosophical question. But for here, Katz is saying, or Wacquant is saying, that we should be mindful that we do not, in our eager to replace this negative stereotype, we risk replacing it with a neo-romantic stereotype. We romanticize homelessness. Because, as Wacquant says, the task of social science, ethnography included, is not to attract sympathy for the homeless or the socially excluded's plight. It is to dissect the social mechanisms and meanings that govern their practices, ground their morality, if such be the question, and explain their strategies and trajectories as one would do for any social category, high or low, noble or ignoble. So, for Wacquant, social science has to dissect the social mechanisms and meaning which govern practices, and ground our mortality, and explain these strategies and trajectories as we would do any social groups in society. So he says this has to be done for socially excluded people also. We're not supposed to just use a positive, give a positive meaning to this, because then you're just posing another stereotype on this group. Wacquant criticizes 3 monographs on social exclusion for being neo-romantic, that is, for romanticizing the homeless and poor populations in society. He claims that these 3 monographs, Dunayer and Anderson and Newman, that they sanitize, that's Dunayer, that they dichotomize, that's Anderson, and that they glamorize, that's Newman. And I will not go into each of them here and his argument, but just sum up that all 3 authors make the urban poor into paragons of morality because they remained locked within the prefabricated problematic public stereotypes and policy punditry for which it is the only guise under which this sub-proletariat is deemed presentable. So he's criticizing these 3 monographs, monographs that Dunayer, Anderson, and Newman, each one have made one, for doing this, fabricating this urban poor into these paragons of morality. So there are 2 opposite critiques of the research and representation of socially marginalized people if we look at Desjarlais and at Wacquant. Desjarlais, who in 1997 is saying that the media and research are showing too dehumanizing description of homeless people and homelessness, that it becomes too dehumanized. Yeah, that was the word. But then there's also Wacquant, who through his criticism of neo-romanticism, that's his concept, right? But through this concept of neo-romanticism, of the urban poor, he's saying that they are being described as too positive figures in anthropological accounts and monographs. And that is, of course, a big problem. And that is one of the debates of representation in anthropology. So, another problem with the anthropological studies into social exclusion is the preeminence of social constructionism, and in particular in their variation of the Foucauldian-inspired analysis of power and governmentality. Inspired by Foucault, various studies have portrayed the social services to the socially marginalized people through the analytical lens of governmentality, that is, through power, basically, or different shapes of power. The welfare state, the public sector's efforts to deliver services, have been analyzed through governmentality and power. We see many analyses of how social workers are using their power to persuade or manipulate the socially excluded person in various ways. Foucault's writing illustrated the important powerful roles institution and welfare state practitioners played in enforcing certain types of power. This Foucauldian ethos and mode of analysis gave way to numerous analyses of welfare state practices as examples of governmentality. So we have all these ethnographic accounts of how the social worker is acting like this, and this is an example of governmentality, or how the nurse is saying and doing this, and this is an example of governmentality. So there's these numerous accounts of this micromanagement of like, what are the social worker, for instance, saying to the client? How is the laughter? How is the posture? It's almost like behavioral psychology, like very narrow analytics of this governmentality towards the client or the citizen. And sociologist Miller and Rose, who has been one of or two of the authors that have helped kickstart this governmentality regime or governmentality way of analyzing government institution and this practice, say themselves, and they say it like this: the little engineers of the human soul and their mundane knowledges, techniques, and procedures, such as psychologists, psychiatrists, medics, accountants, social workers, factory managers, town planners, and others, became the object of analysis. and that a wealth of analysis of welfare state practitioners, such as psychologists and these that he mentioned, in the public sector, they are described as instruments of power and governmentality. Thus, the main problem for the services to socially marginalized people become boiled down to one of power. Even though social workers historically are full aware of their profession as being one defined of ensuring power from a state over a vulnerable and excluded population, this is often the only focus point for qualitative sociological and anthropological analysis of the social services to the socially excluded. So by having this, I think Marianne Valverde calls it a cookie cutter concept of governmentality to analyze state practices like social workers and psychologists. If we have this, then it seems like we're using it to explain what is going on in this meeting between system and client, meeting between social worker and homeless person, for instance, in a case work situation. So, another problem of the representation and study of social exclusion is the focus on interactionism, what I would call is interactionism or symbolic interactionism. The popularity of interactionism has provided us with thick description of human interaction of the socially excluded and social workers in the welfare state. We have numerous descriptions of the action, words, pauses between words, laughter, body language, and so on, which I also mentioned before, in the interaction between caseworker and homeless person, for instance, but less and less on the less visible or even invisible contextual forces the interactions are part of. So even though many studies of an interaction spent do incorporate macro, social, and contextual factors, the main focus is heavily on human interaction. So we focus. This interactionism is a very narrow, nearsighted analytical lens that we are using to understand the social work practice and the meeting with the client and so on. The problem is that we have focused on the interaction between people and not on other relevant aspects of the phenomenon and condition of social exclusion. Criminologists Winlow and Hall argue that a growing proportion of 21st century social exclusion analysis appears to be more interested in the ways in which powerful and influential social groups construct images of the poor as profligate, lazy, immoral, and dangerous. Researchers approach the danger of the stereotype with the broad spectrum antibiotic, simply denying that all universal forms and categories exist. Very little interest is now paid to the realities of social exclusion. So basically, their concern here is that if all this 21st century social exclusion analysis is more concerned with how do we represent the socially excluded, like the homeless people. The problem is that you forget to look at the realities of social exclusion, the thing that does not happen between system and client, or the thing outside the office where client and system is also, which client and system is also affected by. So the social constructivist one-sided focus on which words and categories are used to describe people who are socially marginalized might result in a preoccupation and even obsession with words and categories in replacement of understanding the phenomenon itself. Though the critique of social constructionism and pure phenomenology is perhaps stated a bit unused in the following, one could argue that the deep underlying causes of social exclusion are off limits, or in some extreme cases where pure phenomenological, symbolic interactionism or social constructions discourses are drawn upon, it's reduced to a mere outcome of labeling and demonization. Thus, Winnow and Hall argue that this preoccupation with words and categories are ruining the research into social inclusion as a social phenomenon. The problem is, basically, that we're using way too much time to look at how people are discursively and how do people in words and images and body language relate, like the social worker, for instance, how do they relate to this homeless person in this exact meeting in the office? But as Winlow and Hall say, this is a preoccupation with words and categories that is extreme, because it doesn't allow us to understand the full meaning of what social exclusion actually is, because it focuses on this narrow meeting between system and client, and which words are being used to describe. Should we call them homeless, or should they be called? They shouldn't be called drug addicts. They should be called drug users. You cannot call someone mentally ill. They should be called a person with mental disabilities. And Winlow and Hall are not saying that these categories are not efficient or powerful, and that they're unimportant, but they're just saying that this obsession with how you name things and how you categorize things has taken all the energy and all the resources and all the time out of research into looking how social exclusion is actually a real phenomenon out there, which exists whether you categorize it or not. And therefore, it's important to understand the whole social situation of social exclusion, because it does exist in society. And what does it mean? What is this? And that is one of the prime assignments of social science. So this is actually a critique of the postmodern idea of how to study social exclusion. Yes, now where were we? Sorry, further. So, as they say, from a practical point of view, Winlow and Hall also criticizes this type of research for it being irrelevant for society in general, and in particular of doing no good for the socially excluded population and the social services which are trying to help or alleviate the social problems in society. Winlow and Hall argues that the sudden removal of hostile labeling processes would relieve none of the multidimensional structural pressures that put the exclusions where they are. Thus, its general critique of a social science that does not help explain the phenomenon of social exclusion and how it is created to the rest of society, as well as how the social services impacts on the social problems more generally. For the social service workers and the politicians and administrators, the message seems to be the use of power is crippling for the socially excluded, and efforts must be done to make a better relation between the social caseworker, social pedagogues, and so on, and the socially excluded. Winlow and Hall argue that this is not relevant, since the problem of social exclusion are much more severe than how the social workers are relating to the social excluded individual in itself. Thus, social science, and particularly anthropology, have failed in these last postmodern years, because it has not helped furthering an understanding of social exclusion, homelessness, for instance, and the role of social service and so on, but it has been preoccupied with words and categories. So it's actually one very severe critique of a social science that have been too obsessed with how do we name a homeless person, how do people portray homeless people in the newspaper, and condemning people for calling them this or portraying like that, or saying that these hostile labeling processes are crippling for them, and so on. So this is a problem, because then social science is used, and ethnography, anthropology has failed, because it's used all this energy on how we talk about social exclusion and not focused on what is social exclusion actually, and what real consequences does it have in society. It has not helped the social workers to do a better job. It has not helped the homeless person to become less homeless. And it has basically just said, you cannot use this or this word, you should call them this or this instead. To cut it down, maybe it's too rigid, but just for an understanding's sake. But then, how do we get an understanding of social exclusion? How do we describe it if we want to catch a broader characteristic of it? And how do we make it relevant for the social services, like the social workers, the social politicians, the politicians who has every day to make decisions on how do we make a new shelter for these homeless people, or how to have a drug treatment clinic, and how do we best treat for drug treatment and so on. And how do we make it relevant for society, and not least how do we make it relevant for the socially excluded? I mean, as if it's a job for social scientists, would we not say that that is public value of research? I would say. Thank you. Whoa.